Well, thank you, Monica. Thanks to everyone for coming, and thanks to the organization of this fantastic seminar we are enjoying. The main subject of my presentation will be the changing role of social housing architecture in Latin America. This subject is related to the research we have been developing in the last years, partially with Leandro, Luis, and their team of the FAUSP, also with other researchers and universities. Some results of this research can be seen now at the FAUSP building and are also in this little draft book some of you got yesterday. In my presentation, I will bring forward some general ideas about the role of social housing architecture and also some questions. The first and the main question is this one in the title, Whatever Happened to Social Housing Architecture? In fact, we know social housing was at some point in recent history a central issue for the development of great cities in Latin America, an issue that demanded a strong commitment by modern architects. Let me show you this image you probably know. This is Cerro Piloto in Caracas, with this rather straightforward architecture by Carlos Raúl Villanueva and his Banco Obrero team. You probably remember Henry Russell Hitchcock used this image for the famous MoMA exhibition of 1955. These and other experiences represented, according to Hitchcock, how high were Latin American ambitions in the field of public building. This is a quote. Commenting this particular image, Hitchcock, and I quote again, said this: "The vision of these loose groups of blocks set against the splendid landscape seems to realize one of the recurrent dreams of 20th century urbanism." Well, the splendid landscape is also, if you watch the image, somehow mysterious or intriguing because of this cloud partially covering the hill that adds to this oniric atmosphere of the image. Well, more than 60 years later, and once the cloud has gone, of course, the splendid landscape of Cerro Piloto has turned into something we all know. We know reality overflowed the limits of those modern dreams and imaginations. Of course, today we can easily acknowledge those dreams were somehow naive. The dream that social reform could be operated by architecture, and more precisely by shaping or modeling the physical context of everyday life through housing. Of course, the dichotomy between formal and informal city is schematic, we all know that. Ironically, many of the contemporary discourses that question this dichotomy relate the formal city to the oppressive authority of architects as agents working for hegemonic powers, and the informal one to the free and democratic expression of the people shaping their environment. And so these discourses produce often a stronger and more schematic dichotomy than the one they are trying to contest. It is also frequent today that approaches praising the virtues of this informal or free city use the concept of landscape as a key to understand some values of this city. And this is also significant, in my opinion, because landscape implies a perception from a point of view, and points of view are often conveniently distanced when dealing with this city. And we could talk here about the relationship between detachment and the taste for the sublime, but we don't have time. So anyway, what happened? How did we get there here, and whatever happened to social housing? Well, modern housing architecture and modern city, as you know, became the targets of harsh criticisms during the 60s and 70s because of their rigidity, formalism, inhuman homologation, etc. Knowing the parallel processes of construction in Brasilia and the city built by the so-called free city built by the people who worked in its realization, Sergio Ferro, I hope I am pronouncing it well, Sergio Ferro wrote about the way architectural drawing implied the oppression of the construction worker. Probably you remember. The hegemonic role of drawing is the key to understand the despotic system of building market production, according to Ferro. Also, we cannot overlook that such ethical concerns and other proposals, like proposals for emancipation from centralized housing production systems like John Turner's, implied also a rethinking of aesthetic categories. Umberto Eco's writings on the open work of art are contemporary to John Turner's claims from Peru. According to Turner, workers, builders, the people should be free to build their own houses, while institutions should provide infrastructure and materials, of course. People are solving the housing problem by themselves, skipping the corrupt bureaucracies and inefficiencies of institutions. That is what John Turner more or less claimed. Now, let me read you some quotes and let's see if you identify the author. If there is perpetual change, both in design and execution, the workman must have been set altogether free. Nothing that lives is or can be rigidly perfect. In all things that live, there are certain irregularities and deficiencies which are not only signs of life, but sources of beauty. The variety is the more healthy and beautiful because in many cases it is entirely unstudied and results not from mere love of change, but from practical necessities. The same text I'm quoting mentions things like the love of fact against the love of design, the tendency to set individual reason against authority, or the intolerance to excessive control. Do you guess who wrote these things? It's not Sergio Ferro, it's not John Turner, it's another John, it's another Englishman. Well, this is John Ruskin, writing about the nature of Gothic and the strength of will of the tribes of the North as opposed to the languid tribes of the South. Can you believe it? Amazing. So, could the contemporary taste for variety and the irregular city belong to a similar romantic root? Is it a question of detachment? Is the fascination for the informal the result of the same old patronizing look from the outside? I don't have any answer, sorry. What is sure is on one side that the informal settlements, what we call the informal settlements of today, are far from the emancipatory ideas of John Turner. Later I can maybe explain. On the other side, we know also that discourses claiming the freedom to build and the need to dismantle the centralized production of public housing have been instrumental to the neoliberal turn, not only in America. And here Peru is again the champion with Hernando de Soto, who was mentioned the other day by Nelson, as the guru of the non-regulated city. Regarding the problems, so back to this dichotomy. Regarding the problems of highly centralized production of housing, what can be worse than the inhuman rigidity of mass housing? Well, I think there is worse. Worse than the absolute lack of variety is the fake variety produced by architects, not by processes. The search for variety has been a tendency in European housing in the last decades. Probably you know that. The search for a supposedly lost spontaneity. This was largely reduced to a composition concealing the same old specialities, often. So if one compares the plan of a housing unit in, for example, in Madrid, very recent, with the models of the 20s, or for example, this model housing from the mid-19th century, probably you remember from an article by Robin Evans, we find the same or similar strategies for the separation of families, separation of individuals and activities inside the family, reduction of the collective to a minimum, etc. In the best cases, the search for variety came together with ideas for customization, tailor-made production, or the implementation of real participatory processes in collective housing. These ideals found useful references in Latin America, in Latin American informal settlements, and also in the rediscovery of the old question of incremental housing, from the notorious example of Previ to the recent proposals by Aravena. And in this sense, 2015 was a key moment. In my opinion, that's the year when Aravena got his Pritzker Prize, forgetting about the notorious precedents in Argentina, Colombia, or Mexico. And that same year, the MoMA, you will remember also, organizes a new exhibition on Latin American architecture, just skipping the word architecture in the title, but we can also comment later. And the year after, Aravena curates the Venice Biennale with the reporting from the front proposal. Also, 2016 is the year when the UN Habitat meeting takes place in Quito. So these and other events have supported the idea or the hope that social housing or the low-cost housing could become a central issue again for architects, that architecture could recover its social commitment and Latin America would play a leading role. This possible rediscovery of the issue of housing architecture through Latin America should be put in a wider context. In Europe, the context just before 2015 was sharply described by Bernardo Secchi's last book. Secchi was bold enough to use these terms in his title, the city of the rich and the city of the poor. This is, in my opinion, one of the most important contributions to the understanding of our cities after the financial crisis. And we must keep in mind that Secchi is dealing in this book with the European city. According to Secchi, urban inequality is the rising new urban question, paraphrasing the famous title of Manuel Castells. In Europe, the claim for in Europe there are some specificities. For example, the claim for a more participatory society has been quickly instrumentalized by discourses that support the dismantling of welfare state policies, including housing policies, or what was left of housing policies at the time. Here, the speech delivered by the Dutch king in 2013 has remained a landmark with things like classic welfare state of the second half of the 20th century was over and would be replaced by a participation society for the sake of sustainability. Sustainability, participation, words that were once maybe anti-hegemonic have become something else. No? Thinking today, in my opinion, that a free, unregulated market, housing market, or the informal free housing production, even maybe the incremental based on private property-based production, lead to a more democratic city, in my opinion, is one of the most dangerous oversimplifications of our time, more or less like thinking that democracy can be reduced to voting. A parallel line of oversimplification is that public housing policies and architecture are by nature oppressive or not democratic, that the institutions are by nature disconnected or dissociated from popular interest. This is a dangerous idea, in my opinion. This discourse has led to forget how these and other policies contributed to the reduction of inequality in recent history. And here I quote Secchi. The critical rage in the last decades of the 20th century against public housing programs, urban planning, or the construction of a welfare state through housing, public facilities, green areas, and infrastructures has probably led to underestimate the contributions of urban policies. This is a conclusion by Secchi, acknowledging the paradoxes of welfare state policy, which can also mean the cancellation of diversity and differences. The remark, I think, remains fundamental. Also in Latin America, where inequality is reaching extreme situations. Here I bring this photo by Roberto Huancayo from Lima, just not to put the classical one by Tuca Vieira. These are rhetoric images, of course. I skip here some considerations about the contemporary public policies in Latin America. The policies are still significant, but housing architecture or the opportunity to promote forms of urbanity are somehow taken out of the equation by different ways. I don't have time to explain that. So, just to conclude, this is the context we faced with our little research work and exhibition, an exhibition that, and a work that tried to contest some ruling or hegemonic ways of thinking, like, for example, that public housing is oppressive or bad necessarily. And the exhibition was produced in a collaborative way, and it's a work in progress, of course. The main intention was putting back architecture, or contributing to put back architecture in the equation of housing, and somehow trying to bridge the gap between housing architecture and the city. For this, of course, we are focused on forms and their relations at different scales, at different times, and at different places in 7 cities. And also we try to inhibit the historical context somehow, and place all these architectures in the contemporary city and in our current interests. The main interest being maybe the possibility that housing architecture contributes to a city in which the public and collective dimensions are not lost, and that opportunity is still there, as most of these cases, I think, show that. So that's all. Thank you.